We affirm the United States should accede to the United Nations Convention of Law of the Sea without reservations. Our sole contention is peace in the South China Sea. Douglas Gates, foreign policy analyst for Diplomat, confirms in 2017 that absent the rule of law in the South China Sea has led East Asian countries to believe they can no longer rely on the United States for protection, resulting in an unprecedented naval and military buildup that raises the risk of naval conflict. U.S. calls for peace has fallen on deaf ears. Time magazine Hannah Beach reports in 2016 that Washington's outsider position on UN law of the sea undercuts their message as it urges China to respect global maritime norms. Fortunately, acceding to UNCLOS can alleviate these tensions for two reasons. First is by boosting U.S. credibility. Christopher Lane of the International Affairs Department at Oxford University argues last June that U.S. hegemony is fading in light of Chinese geopolitical leadership challenges with programs like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Belt Road Initiative. According to Princeton professor John Eikenberry in 2017, where Trump's America is ceding credibility on international issues, Xi Jinping is stepping forward. While it's violating UNCLOS, China follows the rules on other international organizations to undercut the United States. If we accede, it forces China to compete with the U.S. for international leadership and thus abide by the law. Patrick Stewart of Atlantic corroborates this in 2012, that U.S. must accede to have a legal standing to legitimately challenge Chinese land claims in the first place. This is crucial for regional stability, as Nicholas Gustev of the World Politics Review explains in 2013, that growing uncertainty about U.S. strength and credibility means that other states who depended on U.S. diplomacy to provide their security will be more inclined to take matters into their own hands. Second is by solidifying multilateralism. John Beneko of the Naval War College articulates in 2011, because UNCLOS is almost universally accepted, United States actions will receive tacit support from 160 nations. Walter Lohman of the National Interest in 2013 explains that U.S. presence in negotiations will allow ASEAN countries to negotiate with China from a position of power, since U.S. will be able to use their soft power to protect them from Chinese backlash. This makes a stricter code of conduct in South China Sea far more likely. According to intelligence analyst Dr. Samir Tata from Forbes in 2017, why ASEAN negotiations are going to work. First, it controls for China's economic influence critical to their regional hegemony. Second, it creates a valuable buffer zone protecting China's vulnerable southeastern underbelly. Thus, Julian Valesco of UCF quantifies in 2013 that these regional actors are 6.7 times more likely to craft a long-term and durable peace agreement. For these two reasons, acceding to UNCLOS could significantly reduce tensions in South China Sea, the impact of which is twofold. First, encouraging social protections. Peter Pham of Forbes argues in 2017 that Chinese aggression has caused its neighbors to increase defensive spending. South Korea's military spending has increased 4%, Taiwan's by 50% in the last year alone, while other countries like Vietnam has increased their defensive spending by more than 400% since 2005. Mario Bowens of London University explains the effect this has in 2012. Because the government's resources are limited, a 1% increase in defensive spending decreases welfare spending by 0.3 to 1%. In a 30-year analysis of data from 33 different Asian countries, Udaya Weigel of the Global Security Policy found in 2016 that each percentage increase in social protection expenditures leads to a 1% reduction in poverty. The improved standard of living also generates stability. Clemson University's Zane Titus quantifies in 2012 that one standard deviation increase in welfare spending decreases predicted probability of civil conflict by 23%. The second impact is preventing regional conflict. Ashley Tellis of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace wrote in 2014 that provocative policies on territorial disputes can produce situations in which even relatively trivial incidents may escalate into full-fledged war, killing millions and destroying financial markets. While China and the United States might not start World War III, instability and land disputes caused by other Southeast Asian nations are becoming more violent and more deadly. For example, in the Thailand-Malay dispute, Adrian Morel of the Asia Foundation found in 2016, between 2008 and 2013, 131 million people saw insecurity and poor conditions in disputed areas with 30 fatalities per 100,000 people yearly. Reduce tensions, reduce poverty, and reduce conflicts, affirm.
Josh, Judge ready? Judge ready? All right. Start time now. We negate. Contention 1 is Arctic drilling. American oil companies are eager to mine the vast oil deposits of the Arctic shelf. Block of the World Watch Institute writes that as the Arctic ice cap shrinks, oil companies are racing to profit from its resources. However, U.S. companies are currently prohibited from exploiting this region because the U.S. is not a party of UNCLOS. The World Ocean Review writes that the U.S. can only claim its continental shelf via UNCLOS, but currently the U.S. cannot stake its claims. This lack of legal recognition is keeping companies from mining. Gardner of the ASP corroborates in 2012, companies need the maximum level of legal certainty before they invest in Arctic exploration, concluding that companies won't drill the Arctic until we accede to UNCLOS. Arctic drilling has dangerous impacts as Wall Street Times writes, drilling in the Arctic will emit significant potent greenhouse gases. Indeed, Greenpeace reports in 2015 that U.S. Arctic drilling will lead to at least 5 degrees Celsius warming by 2100, 3 degrees greater than currently predicted. Problematically, Aton of the Scientific American concludes in a 70-study meta-analysis that the world can expect 7.4% less food yield per degree of Celsius warming. As a result, Barron's of GW says that such a temperature rise means billions of people would face starvation. Contention 2 is the East China Sea. For decades, China and Japan have made competing claims over the resource-rich islands of the East China Sea, materializing in military drills, air flights, and legal claims in the region. These circumstances have created a breeding ground for war. Haas, a Brookings institution, writes that despite its low profile, the East China Sea carries great danger due to poor risk management, frequent close encounters, and high political competition. Moreover, impassioned public opinion hinders de-escalation, meaning even an unintended collision could trigger rapid escalation. Shodan 15 furthers that under current Shinzo Abe's rule, Japanese nationalism is on the rise. Dilo of CNBC summarizes in 2017 that the East China Sea could be the trigger point for a major war. Fortunately, the U.S. is preventing conflict in 2 ways. First, constraining China in the South China Sea. Dasgupta of the Times of India writes in 2017 that the U.S. naval pressure in the South China Sea is keeping the Chinese Navy busy and makes it difficult for Beijing to deal with other territorial disputes. With military resources and political focus constrained in the South, China is unable to expand elsewhere. Party of the National Interest agrees in 2017, undermining China in the South China Sea prevents aggression in the East. Second is strengthening our alliances. Way of King's College writes in 2013 that security cooperation with Japan is undoubtedly the most significant dimension of the Japan-U.S. alliance. Pulling our naval support, a cornerstone of our cooperation, will weaken relations. This is dangerous as Dan Sutherland writes in 2017, China is almost certainly waiting for the perceived downgrading of the U.S.-Japan alliance to seize control of the East China Sea. Problematically, affirming the resolution inhibits the vital U.S. current naval policy in 2 ways. First is restricting hard power. Article 279 of UNCLOS states that parties shall settle any dispute concerning this convention by peaceful means. Thus, the U.S. would hold no credible threat of action in any maritime disputes, allowing China to shift its focus towards conquering the East China Sea. Second is prohibiting naval surveillance. Ridenour of the NCPR writes that Articles 88 and 301 reserve the seas for peaceful purposes and prohibit the threat of force against the state, thus having the potential to constraining U.S. maritime defense operations. However, Ratner of the CFR writes that U.S. information operations are key to hindering China's expansion and garnering regional pressure. The impact of dismissing our current policy is twofold. First, tensions harm trade. Due to low investor confidence and economic retaliation, tensions will inevitably cause trade losses. Morrow of the Political Science Review writes that political disruptions create a risk for business, so only the most profitable businesses can afford to continue trade. In a 23-year study, Gawarkowicz empirically finds that political tensions with China negatively correlated with trade levels. Indeed, the Japan Times finds that during the last minor East China Sea confrontation, Japan-China trade dropped by $28 billion. This harms the lower class, as the World Bank writes in 2015, trade is critical to reducing poverty by increasing jobs and economic growth. Reducing trade by billions will target the poor and raise poverty. The second impact is war. War between China and Japan would be globally devastating due to their advanced militaries and economic clout. The Center for Risk Studies estimates up to 1.4 million casualties would result from aircraft raids on military targets, economic facilities, and ports. Thus, we are proud to negate.
Okay. Everyone good? Cool. So you talk about like constraining China, right?
Right.
So if China stops provoking other countries, do we no longer have this turn to the East Asia problem?
Well, what do you mean by provoking?
Like, if China's more willing to cooperate with other countries, are they going to stop trying to fight, like, countries like Japan or East Asia or whatever?
Oh, no. So we're saying that if there's a resolution in the South China Sea, that frees up their resources for that.
Right, no, I understand. But, like, so the problem in the South China Sea is that China's being aggressive right now and they're trying to expand. Right?
I wouldn't say that the problem is necessarily aggression, but the fact that there's, like, on mutual both sides kind of building up.
Okay, so like,
no,
hold on. Like, okay. if China tones down like their whatever policy that's provoking other countries, can that also apply to like the East Asia?
Well, it depends on how other countries respond. I mean, we talk about how China's acting out of self-defense.
So what's like the conflict in like the East China Sea?
Basically, there are a group of islands called the Senkaku Islands. Sure. They've been historically disputed, and they also have a bunch of resources.
So it's like very similar, right? It's like very similar to the South China Sea.
I would say it's very different, actually, because you have to consider the actors involved. In the South China Sea, you have a lot of like smaller Southeast Asian islands, and also the U.S. But primarily in the East China Sea, this is Japan and China, two countries that have
really
centuries of political and ethnic tensions. Sure.
Okay. So I just think like they sound like they're very similar issues because China's just trying to grab more islands. If we stop the reason,
difference is the interactions.
If we stop the reason why China's trying to grab more islands in the first place, we quell tensions both in the South China Sea and the East Asia Sea.
All right. So let's talk about your second warrant. In your case, you say that UNCLOS helps the U.S. to protect other ASEAN countries with its soft power, right?
If United States affirms,
right,
like if we affirm that we can support UNCLOS,
so we protect them with our soft power.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
We support, like we show support for Asian countries and
show
them
support,
like
okay.
Yeah, right. So they're going to be able to leverage China more effectively
so
because
ASEAN
they're no longer afraid. So like for example, right now the Asian.
So just to clarify, just really quickly, so you're saying that ASEAN countries do want U.S. support before they go to China?
Yes. So they want. They also want us to
like
sign the legislation specifically,
okay,
right?
Sure.
For example, in the case of the Philippines, when China ruled, like when it was ruled by the tribunals that Philippines was correct and China needed to back off, nobody took any action. What they want is U.S. support, so they don't fear any backlash from China.
Have a question?
I do have a question. Let's talk about alliances on your second warrant, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, are you just saying, for example, in the Japan-U.S. alliance, are we just going to pull out all of the military troops that we have?
No, we can still have like troops there, but the point is that the U.S. can't participate in any.
Okay, so how much are we harmed? Like militarily?
How much are we harmed?
Yeah, sure.
Well, we just
like
can't
the alliance is harmed.
Yeah, we can't fight alongside of them. Maybe we can still contribute resources, but we can't.
You just told me that the troops are still there. Why are we harmed?
Right, so we can give them resources. Maybe not like our own U.S. troops, but we can still like help them out. But we can't have the same.
So it's like a marginal decrease in hard power. Time
is running out. Can I ask a question?
Of course.
All right, so let's talk about the standard of living. You give a lot of empirics, but do you have any like actual evidence specifically from these countries following the arms program?
The empirics of standard of living decreasing. They're increasing military spending. For
right.
example,
So like
in Vietnam by 400%.
Do you have any?
That's 400% less money they could spend on social welfare. That's pretty big.
Okay, we're gonna take some prep time.
Oh, actually, can we call for card before
we're gonna do that?
On the impact level, the $28 billion trade loss. I just want to see what conflict that's referring to.
Got it. Okay. And we'll start prep once we get that.
All right, so I highlighted the part for the East China Sea.
Okay, we'll take breath now.
Okay.
We're good. Okay.
Okay. Is everyone ready? Start with their first contention on Arctic drilling. A couple of responses here. The first one comes from Groves of the Heritage Foundation, who explains in 2014 that once the United States is a part of UNCLOS, that means the U.S. oil companies that would be going to the EEZ need to be regulated by the International Seabed Authority. This does two things for their argument. First, it acts as defense on the link because the companies wouldn't have an incentive to drill if like the ISA would have legal authority over them. But secondly, it means we have better environmental policy because now the ISA can sue us. This is especially really good since we just pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. They can put us back on track for environmentalism. The second response is a D-link. It also comes from Groves of the Heritage Foundation, but he reports in 2012 that we already have bilateral agreements so that we can already drill in the Arctic. That's why a lot of companies are starting to do it right now. It's bilateral negotiations. Nothing is unique to signing UNCLOS in the first place. But then, third and finally, the drilling in the Arctic isn't profitable whatsoever because Minor Reform Policy explains in 2016 that the oil shale boom in the United States is much more attractive for these companies. They can make a lot more money, drilling the Arctic is incredibly expensive. There isn't a high probability of them doing that when they can make more profit by doing it in the continental United States. Now let's talk about their second intention that talks about the East China Sea. A couple of uniqueness issues right off the bat. The first thing is that it's dependent on the United States Navy being hampered by UNCLOS. If we can win that, it's not, then that takes out this contention. But the second thing is that the East China Sea, it has to be uniquely different from the South China Sea. They say the thing that's very unique is the actor of Japan and their nationalist belligerency. But the other thing that's happening in the South China Sea is the exact same thing that's happening in Japan. For example, the Philippines president is also taking the same exact steps. I would say the actors aren't that different and unique because the same conflict is happening in both regions that can still trigger both of their impacts. So now let's talk about the specific warranty they give. They say that the U.S. naval presence is what bars China from going into the East China Sea in the first place. A couple problems here. First, China's military is already going to push the United States Navy out of the South China Sea on its current track. Kelly of the Diplomat explains that this trajectory will happen by 2050 at the latest. This is important because this means if we do nothing about the South China Sea conflict, they get the South China Sea and the East China Sea in the long term because they just continue on this trajectory. But furthermore, the United States Navy presence isn't keeping China busy, it's making the conflict a lot worse. Hamza of the Diplomat explains that the United States military is the reason why China continues to be an aggressor because they need to prove that they are on equal par with the United States in terms of their military might, in terms of their hegemony, or provoking even more conflict. But secondly, Hamza continues to argue that our military is exactly what provokes Chinese nationalists that pass more aggressive policies in the South China Sea, making their impacts of war, while it might not be in the East China Sea, just as probable in the South China Sea. But then furthermore, they say that we would be undercutting our allies' support because our military is what supports our allies. Remember, we'll to some extent we'll always be able to back them up with hard power and troops on the ground in those nations so they can feel secure. What matters in stopping China is the United States soft power. That's what can set the difference apart because that's what can get China to stop in the first place, and that's what can make our allies feel more secure if we have their backs in terms of uniting with them. South Korea and the Philippines haven't been able to do anything against China that has caused them to stop, whereas the Asian nations that we talk about in our case actually have economic leverage over China to get them to stop. That's why we need them before they talk about securing our other allies. They give two pieces of solvency. The first one is how UNCLOS restricts the military. A big problem with here comes from Pam Pham of the Diplomat, who explains that basically the military isn't constrained by UNCLOS because it's based on a difference in interpretation. The United States thinks that we can have a military, China doesn't. That's to be ironed out in the future, whereas the United States is the one who designed UNCLOS specifically so that they can still not have a conflict with their Navy operations, so it's non-unique. But then secondly, they talk about stopping surveillance. That's also non-unique. It only has to do with 12 miles off the coast. Intelligence gathering is supposed to be covert. That means if they're discovered now that China's having someone spy on them, that means they'll basically do away with it in the first place. The U.S. can still do this within the parameters of UNCLOS as long as it just doesn't go within 12 miles.
Could we call for the where evidence that says that we're on a trajectory to go into the East China Sea?
The South China Sea.
Yeah, to being run out of the South China Sea. Wait, where does it take 2050 in here?
2020 here.
Which specific part?
Yeah.
Were you gonna say they're pushing the US now?
Kelly, right?
Yeah. Maybe they're multiple sections. Yeah, it's the part that I showed you. It was a little line underneath as well. It's that's the current trajectory.
Alright, that's 6 seconds.
We'll continue running, right?
Yeah.
Alright, that was 56.
Okay, I'm gonna start by on our second contention, and then I'm gonna go down their case.
Okay. You say you're starting on your second contention?
Yeah. Okay.
Oh.
Everybody ready?
Yeah.
Beginning time now. Start on our second contention where we talk about the East China Sea. This is going to be far more volatile than the South China Sea, but more onto that later. First of all, they tell you that this is dependent on the Navy actually decreasing. However, no, really what it's actually dependent on is undercutting China in the South China Sea, and their beach evidence, which is the first piece of evidence that they read in their case, says that we're undercutting China right now. That's their own words. But then second of all, they tell you that Japan is the exact same scenario as everything in the South China Sea. That is completely not true. Right now, China has like control of almost the entire South China Sea. However, nobody has control over the East China Sea, which makes it extremely volatile because that means that it's up for competition. Both nations want it. Their people are like firing the flame that's going to lead to a conflict. Then they read to you a piece of evidence that says that by 2050, with the trajectory that we're on, there's going to be some sort of conflict in the East China Sea. Call for the evidence. It never says that they're actually going to be pushed out. At that point, it never says by 2050 this is going to happen. We would argue that the United States is going to occupy that area anyways, but more onto why there's just this South China Sea is going to remain constant later on. Then they give you tons of piece of evidence that says that the reason why they're progressing right now is because the United States is in the region. That's not true. The United States is just keeping them occupied. Then finally they tell you that hardliners are making these issues worse. They don't tell you that hardliners are the ones that are going to be making the decisions. They don't tell you what sort of effect having hardliners actually has. Then go on to their impacts where they talk, or then go on to their responses on our link level. Basically, they tell you that it's not going to decrease any sort of hard power. First of all, once again, the beach evidence is literally telling you that right now we're undercutting them. If there's no decrease in hard power, then they don't access any of their impacts. But then second of all, it's a perception that the United States is not going to have any sort of credible threat because under UNCLOS, we don't have a credible threat. That's what that's what Article 388 says. That's what Article 301 says, and that's what Article 279 says. At that point, we're winning our East China Sea argument. Let's go on to an overview on their case. We'll start with an overview. We have thought that we were close to war for a long time now. However, nothing that we're doing in the South China Sea is new. That's why Valencia the Diplomat in 2018 explains that the conditions in the South China Sea have become extremely predictable and thus have settled into a new normal. The critical implication of this is that even when tensions are high, tensions have always been high, but since everything that happens is predictable, they will never meet the actual brink of war. Then that means that the AF is creating a much worse problem because remember Dasgupta, who says that the East China Sea, right now we're keeping them occupied in the South China Sea, which stops them from coming into the East China Sea. The East China Sea is a much worse impact and is the most important impact in this round because it's the most volatile area. There are three reasons for this. First of all, there's poor risk management, which means even though everything that's happened in the South China Sea has happened before, we can stop that. But since the East China Sea is an open area, it's going to be a lot harder to stop conflicts from escalating. Second of all, though, is high political competition. Both regions, Japan and China, want this area. At that point, they're both going to be competing over it. Then, third is going to be impassioned public opinion makes de-escalation very difficult. This is a really important response because both countries want it and their public supports it, so don't let them come up here and tell you that no country wants war. Then, let's go into the specific arguments they make. First of all, they tell you that there's going to be an increase in credibility. That's not true, though, because Trump has already backed out of agreements in the past. At that point, the credibility that we have is not going to be very high, even if we sign on to the treaty. Then, second of all, undercutting China is the best way to stop other countries in the Pacific region, and that's the best way we show our support. If we completely stop supporting them and undercutting them like they agree to, then that means that's going to be very bad. Countries are going to feel even less secure. That means an even larger buildup of arms. Then go into multilateral solvency. First of all, there are other reasons why countries are supporting China right now. Wrapping in 2070 rights, that the real reasons why countries support China against international tribunal rulings is because China sends them aid in exchange for their backing. This is not going to change in their world, no matter what countries are going to want to back China. But then then you can delink it again because diplomacy in the past hasn't worked. Prasad the Diplomat in 2016 writes that regulations between ASEAN countries and China usually fails. This is because China generally prefers to make agreements with single states and not a large group of states. At that point, you prefer this evidence because it's empirical analysis of what has happened in the South China Sea. Quickly on their impacts, at the point where tensions increase, countries are going to increase their military spending more. Then, also, they don't actually tell you why that these countries are specifically increasing their military spending. Like, obviously, South Korea is increasing their military spending because of North Korea. And for these reasons, we need it.
During Crossfire, can I give you some evidence?
Yeah.
I'm gonna need your overview. And
Like the public wants war.
yeah, and then whatever you read on the subpoint B that China sends aid.
And also the date on Valencia. Or I guess just show us the whole card.
Wait. Wait, so we just go over that.
Yeah.
So Valencia, the public supports the war, and then China sends aid to these
Yeah.
other nations. South China Sea is predictable.
Oh, right. Yeah, just like your overview cards, and then.
A lot, like, the overview is like a good portion of our case. It's just cross application.
Okay. So yeah, just Valencia, and then
I can
the
see
public
it.
supports the war.
Alright, here's the public supports war.
Okay. And you can say the starting cross, right?
Yeah, that's cool.
Thanks.
And then these two cards. You can click on the one if you need to.
Great, thank you. Ready?
Oh, yeah.
That's okay. Alright. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So you said that the East China Sea is unique because China already controls most of the land of the South China Sea and not the East China Sea, right?
Sure. Yeah, that's one of the reasons.
So how much land in the South China Sea does China control?
It's a sea, so not really land, but I would
Well,
say that
okay,
they have
yeah.
a very
How
strong
much
grip on
territory?
the South China Sea with their island building.
So even though there are more disputes in the South China, even though there are more disputes,
Wait.
more nations in the South China Sea, which under your own logic, that disputes are what create volatility, there would be more volatility.
Wait, are you saying that China does not have the most control over the South China Sea?
I'm not saying it like controls all
China
of it. No.
definitely does.
No, it
Like,
does not control all of the South
No,
China
not
Sea.
all. They don't own that portion of the sea.
Yeah.
But they definitely have the most.
So you're
power.
saying they have the upper
islands
hand in the scenario?
by far. Yes.
Okay, great. So they're already on the trajectory to take both then.
No, I don't think that they're going to completely remove the United.
Okay,
the United
so which
States
is it?
critical to
Which is
staying
it?
there.
Do they have control over the region, which
It's
makes
not
it
one or
not
the
an
other.
issue, or do like
They
you're
have the control of the region, but
Okay.
you have to prove that they're going to completely own that entire region.
Why?
And because if the United States is there, then they don't have enough
Why can't the US
naval
be in the East China Sea?
capital what?
Why can't the Navy be in the East China Sea?
Because there's a trade-off.
So the Navy's not in the East China Sea right now,
we literally
right?
give you two pieces of evidence that you guys don't respond to that say that when China is captivated in the South China Sea, they do not go to the East China Sea. It's like you can't spend all your chips in one place. Could I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay. So let's look at the hardline stuff, right?
Sure.
What decisions do the hardliners make, right? Or in China, right? Like, do they actually have the power to completely?
I would say insofar as militarism has increased, it would prove our warrant true. So yeah.
Wait,
I
what's
would
going to
answer
happen
your
though with
question.
hardliners? Like that's more what I'm getting.
More
Like, what's
military
the-
aggression. So what's the can we just contextualize this issue? Is China increasing the amount of territory, the amount of aggression in the South China Sea right now?
They're trying to, yeah.
Okay.
True. But it
So
doesn't matter. Like
they are being more aggressive.
Yeah.
Which is so that is
Are
the
we
link
really
to our
being
impacts. Chinese aggression is what causes other nations to increase their defense spending.
Chinese
It's
aggression
what causes
to-
other nations to feel insecure,
Okay.
which creates more land disputes,
Like,
which creates more conflict.
that's just
so
in
you're
a
willing to
very
concede
snapshot.
that these
Really?
impacts
Wait,
happen
could I-
because it's not as big as
could I
a
actually
low probability argument in the East
Could I
China
actually
Sea.
respond? So that's a very short snapshot. What we're saying is that China can get some land and then gain territory and gain more power, and they can decrease. But
So-
it doesn't matter because they're never going to get the full region as long as the United States is there. You guys don't
Okay,
believe that.
so
and we're
you're
saying that
biting
there's
the
a new
bullet
normalcy.
and saying China will get the South China Sea, but it's better because they're not going into the East China Sea.
Yes,
So
we
you
give you a-
concede our impacts basically
No,
by
wait,
saying they take control of the South China Sea.
we do not
right?
concede your impacts. I read responses, I think, in rebuttal
I mean,
that said that multilateral sovereignty doesn't work and you don't increase credibility.
So I'm just saying you prove that they're true. If China takes over the region, bad things will happen in the South China Sea.
If
That's
China-
the link into the impact.
Yes. No. If
That-
China
that's
takes over the
our
South China
impact
Sea,
being
then it's
triggered.
bad in the East China
Great.
Sea.
And so we just have to weigh the two then.
I don't know who's this was. I will keep it. But Okay. I'm gonna start on their overview. And I'll sign first from there. So everybody ready? Let's start on their overview. The problem with the overview is that essentially what they're talking about in their second contention and their overview is all one big argument about why China wants to expand. But the problem with this is the same policy they're enacting in the South China Sea, the same exact policy they want to enact in the East China Sea. They want to expand these islands. Remember what we talked about in first crossfire is that China just wants more islands because they want to have the natural resources under the islands. But realize this still violates UNCLOS and the public does, this still violates UNCLOS. And if we're going to win our multilateralism diplomacy argument in our subpoint B, we would pre-record their case because if we solve for the South China Sea and the inherent reason why China wants to continue to expand in the first place, we would stop the East China Sea conflict as well. I would say it's better to influence them multilaterally through Asian countries, because that's going to give us more diplomatic support rather than just US unilaterally acting. Go to our argument about multilateralism. He says that China sends aid, and that's why we're really safe. China sends aid right now, and that's why we're not going to be able to influence the Asian countries. But his card isn't specifically about Asian countries. I would say that's not true. Then he says that China and Asian diplomacy always fails. The reason why it's failed in the status quo, for example, in the Philippines, is because they don't have US support, and these Asian countries fear backlash from China. If we sign UNCLOS, what Veneco tells you is that 160 nations, including the Asian countries, are going to support the United States and support the Asian countries to influence China for two ways. That's why Tata tells you exerting an economic influence and using them as a buffer zone is how Valesco tells you ultimately using these multilateralism efforts we can 6.7 times more likely to craft a long-term durable peace agreement. That's far more probable. This gives us less tensions and ultimately our first impact on social protections, where we tell you a 1% increase in defensive spending decreases welfare by 1%. This trade-off is really problematic because this welfare spending actually protects people from poverty. Go to their case. You can still vote for us off of their case. The inherent reason why China is aggressive in the first place is because they've come out and said they're okay with working with the United States, just not okay with US military presence. This is why Hamza tells you that essentially all this aggression is caused by our military presence. If we can tone that down by signing UNCLOS, you don't have to corner the dragon, and the dragon will breathe fire on you. For these reasons, affirm.
That was a good line.
Thank you.
All right, we'll take some prep time.
What we did all last night was just try and think of one-liners.
That's the crap we did last night.
It'll be their case and then our case starting. Yeah. Okay. Time's ready?
Yeah.
Judge ready? Alright. I'll start time now. Start on their South China Sea argument. They say at the top that there are the same policies in the East China Sea and South China Sea, and thus if you solve the South China Sea, you solve China's issues in the East China Sea. However, they fundamentally misunderstand what the difference is between these two. In the East China Sea, you have centuries of political and ethnic tensions, and this is actually between two comparable powers. Japan actually has the power to challenge China. They have comparable militaries. So what this is about is establishing dominance over Asia. China already has dominance over smaller countries in the South China Sea, but they're concerned about dominance in the East China Sea, and that's why there's actually a risk of war there. And now we can see that they're going to solve the South China Sea, but go to their impacts. Mitigate their, they only extend their first one on social protection, but mitigate this because one, there's a low correlation. They say a 1% increase in spending decreases welfare spending by 0.3%. And secondly, they only use empirics. They never give you actually any case studies that show that poverty is actually increasing in these countries. Go to our case, first contention on Arctic drilling. They say that, they turn it by saying that there are better environmental regulations in the AF. However, UNCLOS is not binding and it's non-enforceable. There's no impact here. Go to our second contention on the East China Sea. First, let's talk about this in the East China Sea. First, let's go to our first uniqueness. We talk about constraining China, the South China Sea. They say that the U.S. is going to be pushed out by 2050. However, what Valencia says, we reach a new normalcy of tension. There's always going to be this level of tensions there. They say that China's going to push the U.S. out, but their evidence doesn't say by 2050. And so at the end of the day, what happens is that they link into our case. By solving the South China Sea dispute, which has minimal impacts on the regional actors, you actually solve this dispute and allow China to pivot and dedicate its resources to the East China Sea. When it can now move all of its naval resources towards the East China Sea, this increases tensions. But this is dangerous because Howe says that there's no risk management mechanisms in the East China Sea. Whereas they've been established in the South China Sea, there are no bilateral agreements here, and tensions are much higher, especially with impassioned public opinion. The impact here is that tensions harm trade. Remember, the last time there was a confrontation, Japan Times quantifies there's a 28 billion drop in trade. So we can quantify and tell you right here that there's going to be tens, if not billions of dollars of trade loss. This means not millions of lives and poverty affected in both countries. Moreover, extend the World Bank, which says that trade is critical to reducing poverty. At the end of the day, we can clearly show you that poverty is going to definitely increase, while they have nebulous impacts at best. Thus, I'm proud to negate.
Okay. Ready for a cross?
Yeah.
Okay. So you said the last time there was a dispute in the East China Sea, all this like trade failed.
Yeah.
So why wasn't there a war?
Well, simply because it wasn't escalated to the point that it is right now. We all know that China's been building up their military. So now if they can pivot, and the U.S., if they can pivot towards the East China Sea with this new military, they're willing to go to war.
Okay. Follow-up question. If we have diplomatic leverage over China, why is it only in the South China Sea that we can use it?
Wait, so I'm confused about what you mean by this diplomatic
So,
leverage.
in summary, you said that, you concede the South China Sea, and then you try to minimize our impacts. But our link was about having diplomatic leverage over China to stop the South China Sea. So if we have diplomatic leverage over China, and you conceded
so just to
why can't
clarify-
we use that to stop future conflicts in the East China Sea as well?
Wait, so just to ask about your contention, you're talking about ASEAN being supported by the U.S. and negotiating with China.
Yeah.
So it's
Right,
not
but they have a
specific,
history
right?
of
It's not like-
diplomacy. They've been making agreements for decades.
No, but
in the East China Sea, we don't have the same level of
uniqueness I
influence.
talk about in summary is about U.S. support for it, and I don't think that was ever responded to. But I don't think diplomacy is a one-time thing, right? It's not one-time
that's
diplomacy,
true.
now it fails again. But if we establish this relationship, we're going to be able to reinforce it in the future and also
Wait,
apply
so
it to
just
the East
because
China
we
Sea.
support one
But
agreement with
I
China
feel like
doesn't
we're just
mean
going
they're
in
going to agree
circles.
with
Can I ask a
everything.
more specific question?
Well, I
this
think
is
we should
actually
just clarify, there's a big difference between these two scenarios. In the South China Sea, ASEAN,
I'm sure
they've
there's
been making
and we're saying
but
we'll
it's just
stop
not
the
going to
root
have the
cause
same
of
effect on
both.
the East China Sea.
So
We're
that's
saying
sort of what I
stop
wanted
the
to
cause of
ask
both.
about, right? Can I ask that?
Yeah.
question? All right, so what does China want from the East China Sea?
It's mostly about, if I'm going to be honest,
we
it's
talked
about
about this in
establishing
first class.
dominance.
It's
Because
about
these have been two
establishing
competing powers for
Right.
centuries.
So
and
what
they've
is
ethnic-
so what's China doing in the South China Sea right now?
Well, a lot is about posturing against
Right.
other
So they're
countries.
also establishing dominance
no,
against.
no.
Can I finish?
Okay.
They're establishing dominance against countries such as the Philippines, Vietnam, by expanding their islands and their regional hegemony. If we solve for this problem, the central thesis of your case, okay, both scenarios are the same. They're just trying to establish dominance through these islands.
Is it okay if I respond?
Go
Okay.
for it. Yeah.
So the difference here is the actors. You guys conflate the two, the Southeast Asian actors and Japan, by saying that
Okay.
they're similar.
Okay.
But is it okay if I
so-
just explain for a
Wait,
second?
if we stop China in the first place, why would Japan matter?
Is it okay if I just explain?
Go for it.
Okay,
Okay.
so the difference is that if you look at these smaller countries, they just simply have smaller militaries, and they've backed down to China before. There's no question of who's dominant in this
right.
relationship. But if you
No-
look at
no doubt.
Japan versus China, there's a much more comparable military force there, which is why
I
there's
understand,
competition.
but we're just saying that the Asian countries are one channel for us to reinforce our diplomatic leverage against China. If we win that warrant,
Right, but you guys just assume that this is
hold on.
going to be the breaking point.
If we win that
for Japan.
warrant, that also applies to other areas. It doesn't
No,
matter.
that doesn't mean we can convince China to do whatever we want just because it works once.
I think it's far more likely that we can than just East China.
Right, well,
Sea
it's better to just
erupting
not let
in
the
war
situation
for no
escalate in the
reason.
first place, is what we're saying.
Okay, that's fine.
Right.
Is everyone ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. They lost the round in second summary when they conceded that the South China Sea conflict was going to happen regardless, and they concede the link there. This has two implications. First of all, we're still going to argue if we have diplomatic leverage over China from the South China Sea conflict, we can use that diplomatic leverage over China and their regional influence to stop them from going into other conflicts and stop them from provoking Japan in the first place. We solve both conflicts because diplomatic leverage and economic leverage are constant. But secondly, it would non-unique their entire case, because if China's already going to take over the entire South China Sea conflict, then they can already go into the East China Sea as well, so they also don't have any offense over there. The only risk of offense in the round based on their summary is if you vote pro off of having the risk of having the HR members stop China with the credibility argument. That is the cleanest link to our impact. They even conceded. Let's explain why that matters. They just say we give a bunch of empirics. Yeah, we give empirics because this has happened. It's a case study from 33 different Asian nations. Andrew extended it very cleanly in summary. The Chinese aggression in the South China Sea causes them to increase military spending. That does two things. First, it cuts welfare spending by 1%, which leads to another 1-to-1 ratio increase in poverty. That's a form of conflict. That's a form of negative impact. It also outweighs on probability versus their war with Japan argument. For instance, there have been conflicts in the past in Japan. It's a very low probability. We haven't erupted into war yet, so we win our impact on probability. But also on time frame, because if we have diplomatic leverage over China to quell tensions in the South China Sea, that also solves for the root cause of their case by making them go into the East China Sea as well. And the tensions provoke conflicts between other South China Sea nations, so that's also another geopolitical war impact that we can stop there. But now, even if you don't think that's enough to win us the round, we still win off of the East China Sea argument based on the turn that they never handled properly in summary on the military is the thing that provokes China in the South China Sea and can further provoke them in places like the East China Sea. That's the Hamza evidence. That's the reason why they're being more aggressive, because they're competing with the United States to be the superpower, and the military is the direct threat to that. That's what causes them to lash out in the South China Sea, and that's also what can push them to expand that aggression to the East China Sea as well. So on both fronts of the debate, we win.
Alright, we have Brad, Rob.
Okay. Is everybody ready? Okay. I'm going to begin time. Starting now. This round comes down to the East China Sea versus the South China Sea. At the end of the day, we're going to be winning because we proved to you that the East China Sea is a much larger threat. First of all, they try to conflate the idea with the South China Sea solving for the East China Sea. However, they are just asserting this. They don't actually give you any reasoning for why all the principles are going to be the exact same and why they can actually apply them. Remember our warning that says that the East China Sea has centuries of politics behind it, and there's a lot of different things that fuel this conflict. They don't give you a single piece of evidence to say that they're actually able to solve for this. Don't let them just say that it's just going to conflate over and it's just going to solve in the South China Sea. That makes literally no sense, and it's not warranted at all. Then they tell you that, then the second thing they say is that there's a non-unique in our case, because if the South China Sea is going to be solved no matter what, then that means the East China Sea is going to have a pivot. The biggest thing here is we're not conceding it happens in both worlds. We're saying that you're only going to solve this in their world. That's really important, because only in our world are they actually going to pivot to the South China Sea. At that point, you extend that scoop the evidence that says that when the South China Sea is resolved, that's when you see a pivot to the East China Sea. The East China Sea is far more volatile than the South China Sea. At that point, let's go on to the weighing, which my opponents really never addressed. First of all, they give you the Hamza evidence on their side that says that you increase aggression. However, they drop the Valencia evidence, which is the most important piece of evidence in the round, because it tells you that we have reached a new normalcy in the South China Sea. This is really critical, because no matter what, we are never going to hit the brink of war in their side, even if tensions increase, even if we see a more aggressive U.S. That's really important, because this is defense that they don't respond to, and they have no defense on why the East China Sea is less volatile. Remember all the reasons why we give you for why the East China Sea is a much more volatile region. First of all, we tell you that this is land that needs to be competed over. China and Japan both want it. That's different from the South China Sea because China has most of this area. Then second of all, public opinions back it. Both countries, their people want it. There's Japanese nationalism that is supporting the possibility of war. At the end of the day though, they're not going to be accessing their impacts on their side. They talk about welfare. This is a really long link chain. Basically they're saying spending goes up, which they don't prove is because of tensions. Then social protection goes down. Their social protection is going to decrease the standard of living. That's a really long link chain. Just vote for us because we prove to you that war happens, and then trade is going to increase like it has in the past when there's a full pivot. Or decrease, sorry.
You're right, guys.
You're right.